Welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast about neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We're a group of PhD students studying computational neuroscience. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Connor.
And the topic for this episode is Blue Brain, which is a large-scale attempt to simulate the brain in a computer. So I guess we should start with what this project is and when it was founded and who's behind it. So the project was founded in May of 2005 by Henry Markram, who is the head of the Brain and Mind Institute at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne.
It's École Polytechnique.
Or EPFL, which is located in Switzerland. And the goal, especially in the early stages, was to simulate a simple unit of the brain that's known as the cortical column in a computer.
So like Grace said, the original aim of the Blue Brain project was to simulate one unit of the brain, and in particular of the cortex, which is the kind of most recently evolved part of the brain. That unit is called the cortical column, and the precise definition of a cortical column is actually still debated. What exactly that even means is not totally agreed upon by all neuroscientists. The idea was put forward, I think, in like the 50s, maybe 40s, 50s, I think, by Vernon Mountcastle, who's a very famous neuroscientist who had a big influence. And the idea is just that if you look across the cortex, there are certain details of the organization of the neurons, the cells in the brain, and the way that they connect to each other that are kind of similar across cortical areas. And so Mountcastle put forth the idea that the cortex essentially consists of a repeated unit, which he called the cortical column. The idea was that that unit would have some organizational structure that was shared across all of the cortex, and that structure defined some kind of computation that a column would do, and that by changing sorts of inputs to the column, which could be say from sensory receptors like some visual receptors on the retina, or from receptors in the ear and the cochlea or something, you could perform different computations, but there was some kind of generic computation underneath. And so this has kind of been it's become a sort of canonical idea in neuroscience, especially in the study of the cortex, that there is such a thing as a cortical column, and that it's kind of central. Understanding the cortical column is maybe central to understanding the brain. So it seemed like, I guess, a natural place to start.
At least as a small unit of neurons that maybe had some coherent purpose. It's like a reasonable place to start.
And especially to the people who do believe that it is kind of a universal computational unit, it wouldn't really matter which part of the brain you try to, which area you get your data about this column from, because maybe all the columns everywhere are more or less the same.
And moreover, maybe even across mammals, there's some similar structure.
Yeah, that's not universally agreed upon. That's debated. Not everyone holds that view, but if you do, then maybe it makes sense to start by seeing if you can model this unit in a computer, and if you can, then perhaps it means you understand it and you understand a unit of the brain.
And in a sense, I think they're doing reasonable and impressive experiments when they try to do this, right? They record from 10 or 20 neurons at a time, simultaneously, to try to probe connections and sort of the physiology of how the neurons interact. But I mean, for perspective, how many neurons are there in a cortical column?
I think in a mouse, people think it's like 10,000, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So even these, kind of really impressive experiments they're doing with the recording many neurons from the same cortical column, they're up to small 10, 20 neurons. Yeah. Like that's, kind of impressive technically by the standards of what people regularly do. But it's a very small number of neurons.
So let's talk about what they're actually doing, because they do have this experimental component along with the simulation component. And people tend to focus more, at least in the press and these sorts of things, on the idea of simulating the brain. But in order to simulate parts of the brain, you need to collect enough data to know how to simulate it, to have the parameters to put in your model and that sort of thing. So they have experiments going on as well under this project.
Let's go back for a second, because I don't think we're finished really introducing what the project is. Okay, so we talked about how Markram started in 2005, and what was known as the Blue Brain project, that was intended the first goal they had was to simulate a full cortical column. And there's like a whole bunch of issues that we'll get into, like what does it mean to simulate a cortical column even? and then things like what are the goals. This project evolved over the years and now has changed its name and is getting a huge amount of media attention as the Human Brain Project. And so it's it's in the media seen as the European counterpart in a way to the US Brain Initiative. So the US has this Brain Initiative, the EU has this Human Brain Project, which are both these really large scale, in terms of the amount of money involved and the number of researchers and the supposedly ambitious goals, projects aimed at understanding the brain in general. They're very different in terms of their structure and their goals and how they're allocating money and resources.
So, as I understand it, in the United States with the Brain Initiative, basically it's kind of a centralized heading for distributing money to independent researchers to work on their projects, largely related to kind of developing new technologies and things that will improve the ability of generally neuroscientists to develop science.
The important focus of the Brain Initiative is that it's on tool development. It's kind of the hope that if we have the right tools, then we'll be able to study the brain better, and the best way to advance the study of the brain now is to just advance those tools.
And in contrast, the aim of the Human Brain Project, which is the European project that we're talking about today, is, there are many aims now, but it started basically as the elaboration or the sort of changing of name and changing of structure of the Blue Brain Project, and the main aim of that is to simulate the human brain is their sort of very long-term goal or whatever.
Yeah. With stepping stones along the way, with simulating smaller mammals.
Yeah. And so the reasons that they give for why this is a good idea and worthwhile and could be beneficial is that they say it would provide a tool for researchers, and you could view this as a different solution to the problem of our tools of neuroscience being limited today. You could say, you should develop new tools, which is the US Brain Initiative, and the Human Brain Project kind of has a view of, if we just simulate everything in a computer, then we can record any detail we want and we can make any manipulation we want, and we don't have to design new tools because we can just use computer simulations.
Yeah, so like in a sort of very naive and high-level way, the kind of overall motivation that is kind of cool in a very abstract sense, but not necessarily plausible to regular researchers, is that by building a machine that simulates the brain, all of your experiments can be done on this machine instead of on real brains.
And according to Henry Markham and the people behind Blue Brain, or the Human Brain Project, this will lead to understanding of drugs and perhaps development of new therapies, and they really kind of describe a medical benefit, a benefit to the study of medicine and of mental diseases and that sort of thing, that they hope to come out of creating this large-scale simulation.
So, I think in a certain sense, there's like kind of almost a long history of this idea. People who are very avidly pro-animal rights, and also people who think that kind of there's only a certain amount of resolution you can get out of like invasive biological studies just because you can't observe all of the variables, would say, hey, the right way to go about this is to figure out enough about the brain that you can simulate it, you can do all of your experiments there, and it's kind of open. You can look at every variable as it's going on. But the sort of catch to that, and possibly, I think why many researchers would be skeptical of this kind of whole endeavor, is that you actually have to have an accurate model of the brain for that to be at any value. And it has to be at the right level of resolution. So, right, you have to pick how detailed you want to model, right? You don't necessarily care about quantum phenomena or atoms or maybe even, small molecules. Maybe you care only about kind of large molecules or sort of membrane level activity or the sort of communication between neurons with other neurons. And so there's kind of a lot of ambiguity as to how you can do this, what's feasible, and what's realistic about your model relative to real brains. Yeah,
to elaborate on that a little bit, this word, simulate, it's funny. I think when normal non-scientists kind of think of, scientists are simulating the universe, scientists are simulating the solar system, or scientists are simulating the brain, it's like, what does it mean to simulate something, right? You can't literally simulate the brain unless you have equations that describe how all of the variables that you think describe the brain evolve over time and interact with one another. So, for example, like, you might want to know how much a single neuron in some brain area is firing over time. and how much multiple neurons in some brain area are firing as a function of time and how they all interact with one another. To simulate that, you have to actually specify in a lot of detail exactly what the equations are that you think govern those interactions. And so that entails a lot of either knowledge about the brain or whatever it is you're trying to simulate, or assumptions about whatever it is you're trying to simulate. So there's no such thing as kind of simulating something in some magical way. You have to basically have a lot of assumptions or knowledge about the thing you're trying to simulate. You can have emergence from that. You can simulate sort of what you know and then guess other things, and then you will learn new things in an emergent way because there'll be emergent dynamics and properties of your simulation that you didn't put in explicitly. But I guess the idea is that in order to be hopeful that there will be interesting emergence from a simulation, you need the simulation to be like quite good to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so that probably is a reasonable way of summarizing at least one of the objections that a lot of people have, which is that we just aren't anywhere close to having enough initial knowledge to make models that are going to be useful, in the sense that the things that emerge from them will be, will guide us in meaningful, interesting ways, I guess.
Yeah, I think that one of the main differences between the type of simulation that this project is putting forth versus what more run-of-the-mill computational neuroscientists do in individual labs is related to the idea that we don't know enough, and for that reason most people use very simplified versions when they're modeling, and they make specific choices about what parameters are relevant and which ones they want to vary to see what happens, So you can imagine if you're trying to make a model of the retina and you know that there are cells in the retina that respond to when motion hits the retina. You might think, okay, well, I have some guess as to how you could end up with a cell that responds when there's motion. Maybe it's if certain cells are connected in a certain way and have certain differences in timing, you could end up with a cell that's responding to motion. So I'm going to build a toy model where I have cells and I play around with their connectivity and I play around with their timing, and I see if I end up with a cell that has a response to motion. And so there you're really distilling down what you think is important and seeing if you can get the desired result. Whereas in this, they obviously have to make some decisions about what is important, but they're really being very inclusive and kind of modeling in as much detail as they can manage and not really focusing on the specific output that they care about to determine if they've succeeded. They're just trying to get as much information as they can and put it into a model and see what happens in what seems like a pretty general sense.
But so at a very high level, I think it's worth keeping in mind, right? So a simulation, we've talked about, right, is of a model, and a model kind of embodies a hypothesis. So in trying to, maybe their motivation at some kind of abstract level is they want to be as hypothesis-free about what the relevant variables are as possible. So just put everything in and see what's relevant, or see what comes out of that model. But of course, even by putting those things in and the way they're putting these things in, they're still making some statements of hypotheses in putting those into the model.
So we should talk about what level they are focusing on versus what is commonly used. And so I would say that it's very common to represent neurons in a simulation as something that's called a point neuron, which just means basically that there's one equation. It turns inputs that would be going into that model neuron into something that represents perhaps a firing rate or spike times.
Or some sort of activity level of a neuron or a small population.
Yeah, and so it's usually just one equation per neuron.
And one variable that captures the activity of that neuron per neuron, or potentially a small number of variables that correspond to hidden properties like the synaptic level of adaptation of the neuron and also its activity level.
Yeah, but usually just a low number of equations and parameters and variables that represent each neuron. Whereas in the Blue Brain project, they are making very detailed models of individual neurons that include specific details about the shape of the neuron, meaning kind of the length of the processes that come off the cell body, the angles that those processes have, distributions of specific ion channels on the cell. I've heard that each neuron can have up to 20,000 equations. And so that's an extreme level of detail that most scientists interested in modeling aspects of the brain just aren't focusing on. And
to give them, some credit for this, right? That there are other groups affiliated with various institutions that claim to do things like simulate large populations of neurons or the whole brain. And in using point neurons connected in kind of arbitrary fashions, they're often being extremely hyperbolic. Here, when they claim to be simulating the whole brain, I think they are doing something that is a bit more satisfying in terms of the scope. Like, they really are attempting to simulate the whole brain. I think the sort of qualms that many researchers would have in accepting that they're simulating the whole brain is kind of almost higher level things like, is the sort of macro connectivity right? Or things like this.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
People aren't really objecting to the nature of the single unit, single neuron kind of simulations, right?
There are other groups not related to this project that focus on models of individual cells with as much detail. This is just the first time that models with that much detail are all being connected together in, something that's on the level of, as we said, a cortical column.
What's the actual current state of the art in terms of their simulations? Do we know? How many neurons have they simulated? And what do they do with those simulations? Do we know that?
And one of the things we read in preparing for this, there was a comment that the lead investigator made, something to the extent of, basically they have a lot of the data they want to do this, but they haven't bought or can't afford the bigger computer to pull off the simulation. They keep adapting and upgrading their computing system. I think to some extent, in their mind, they would like they need a computer that's sufficiently powerful to pull off the full simulation, and then they could kind of incrementally improve the resolution of that simulation.
So we should say that it's called Blue Brain because they're using the Blue Gene computers from IBM, which are supercomputers that are designed kind of for applications to large-scale science projects.
But yeah, as I understand, it's not just one computer. Like they've actually upgraded the computer multiple times.
They have different models of Blue Gene that come out. But there is an issue that in doing as much as they're doing, it almost feels like they're doing nothing. Like they're doing so much that you're not actually getting anything from it. There's a description on the website that is explaining what they hope to, like data that they hope to collect to help inform their modeling. And they list as things that they're going to collect is information on the genome, the transcriptome, the proteome, the biochemical-ome, the metabolome, the organellome, the cellome, the synaptome, and then they stop with the ohms for some reason. Extracellular space, microcircuits, mesocircuits, macrocircuits, vasculature, blood, the blood-brain barrier, ventricles, cerebral spinal fluid, and the whole brain. So it's a little bit difficult to understand exactly what the focus is and what the measure of success is when it just seems like they want to get all of the information and put it into a computer.
I mean, on some level, I think there really is kind of this unspoken but kind of always hinted at hope that they're going to just put all of this stuff in and the brain's going to wake up and tell them that it's been solved. Right? It's like, oh, yes, I'm a brain. Like they're kind of expecting that to be the...
I think they must actually expect that. Markham must... Because there's a thing here in an interview with him where they ask him about AI, artificial intelligence. They say, have you collaborated with any members of the artificial intelligence community? Is your project affecting the artificial intelligence field? And Markham says, no. Blue Brain adopts philosophy that is pretty much 180 degrees opposite to the philosophy in AI. In my view, AI is an extreme form of engineering and applied math where you try to come up with a God formula to create magical human powers. If you want to go into AI, I think you have to realize you are making the assumption that your formula will have to capture 11 billion years of evolutionary intelligence. In most cases, AI researchers not even know what a neuron is, let alone how the brain works, but then they don't need to because they are searching for something else. I don't blame them for trying because if you want to build clever devices today, it is much easier to ignore the brain. It is just too complex to harvest the technology of the brain. Look at speech recognition today. The best ones out there don't use neural principles.
Which might be out of date at this point.
At this point, well, it depends on what you mean by a neural principle. But having said that, we all know how inadequate the current devices are, and that is just because AI can't even come close to what the brain can do. Blue Brain is not trying to build clever devices. It is a biological project that will reveal systematically the secret formulas operating, but Blue Brain models and simpler derivative models will gradually replace all of AI. Right. So he literally thinks we're just going to plug all this shit into this massive computer, and then it's probably going to wake up and tell them to stop.
He has. AI research. So I find it funny because the website for Blue Brain, when you look at the goals, it says those things about medical approaches and understanding drugs and being a tool for researchers. But then when you hear Markham talk in interviews, or I think in his TED Talk, I mean, he uses the word consciousness. Like, he brings that up as an end goal in some sense of this project. And it's just not clear the mechanism by which that kind of advance would come about when you're just throwing all of your parameters into a simulation.
That also hints at the fact that when this project started, people heard about it as a sort of kind of wacky thing that this guy was doing. He's a bit of a character, right? And when people talk about him as a person, he seems to be sort of an interesting dude. Or funny, eccentric.
I think part of the weirdness is that if you look at the details of how they build this model, which is part of the reason why it feels like you're not going to actually get that much understanding out of it, it seems like they tried to automate the process of building the model. And I think for a lot of people who build models of things, you realize that that's when you figure stuff out about the system that you're interested in, is when you're actually going through the process of deciding which parameters you care about and fiddling with them and that sort of thing. And as far as I can tell, they're kind of proud of their streamlined process of figuring out, collecting all the experimental data and just turning it into parameters in some kind of predefined models and then putting it all together.
But I don't know, for large-scale projects, I mean, I kind of interpret them as doing something maybe like video game designers do, which is to, you don't write every line of code to build your physics engine for your video game and put all of the characters in there and have them tell a story. You kind of build a world builder in your video game, and then you can kind of, at a higher level of abstraction, using kind of a character designer, like an artistic palette and things like this, you can put things together. So, if you're trying to architect a whole model of the brain at a very large scale, you've got to have kind of multiple levels of resolution. You write your equations in one part of it. Probably somewhere else, you kind of use like a GUI or, like a high-level graphical user interface to plop down neurons in various parts, and then maybe you copy whole cortical columns at with a different kind of, user interface. And so, in some case, I don't know if there's, I don't object to that kind of methodologically. Maybe it's just, again, kind of, more what assumptions they're putting in and what they're kind of just hoping they'll see kind of emerge from it. I mean, kind of, today, there's a whole fad kind of around emergence in the humanities and certain kinds of sciences. There's just kind of this notion that you can sort of transcend levels of explanation. It's sort of anti-reductionism, right? I mean, there's this kind of notion that you can
will be greater.
The sum
will be greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly, and there's a lot of criticism aesthetically about reductionism, as though people are kind of losing information and looking at smaller and smaller phenomena, and now we need to kind of build outwards and start putting pieces together to get whole cohesive narratives. It sounds nice when you say that, but there's a skepticism that I have that a lot of this is just not trying to explain high-level phenomena and just kind of hoping that the pieces that you have will kind of produce them, emergently. Basically, whenever you don't know how to go from small to big stuff, you can just kind of wave your hands and say, oh, it will emerge.
I think that relates to something we've talked about before, which is kind of funny because it's about artificial intelligence, I think. Deep networks and so on. We were talking about how when you're doing machine learning, artificial intelligence, this thing that Markham was saying he's 180 degrees away from, you're also trying to sort of build machines and computer algorithms that can do impressive, intelligent seeming things. And that is kind of emergent as well, perhaps. It doesn't have to be. But if you don't sort of think that you know how the intelligence is going to work in a detailed way, but rather you sort of try to have some very large system that can learn from data, intelligent, algorithms or behaviors, then you're also looking for a sort of emergence. So it's like a similarity between this and some stuff in AI, even though he says that he claims to be totally different to artificial intelligence. In a way, there's a similarity there, except that he's kind of going the other way around. he's not trying to have a system learn to be intelligent from an abstract point of view, like look at the data, do some basic, learning, and now become intelligent and do things. It's more like put in all of the tiny details of something we know is already intelligent, a brain, and again, hope that probably something interesting emerges, right? Maybe like intelligence. So.
It would be like building a computer purely by looking at it and having no working knowledge of how computers actually work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also like ignoring kind of software and learning altogether. I mean, like it's always struck me as a little bit weird that you would expect to have a sensible model of the brain when like a baby's born and they don't do all that much innately. And there's some good structure there upon which learning happens. And so learning takes a year or two of engaging with your environment and learning from sensory stimuli and things like this. And if their simulations run at like 200 times slower than real time, it would take many, many years, 200 times 2 years, so 400 years, right, to train their baby blue brain to be a sort of interesting individual, as opposed to just kind of an infant that's kind of moving around chaotically or something.
Yeah. So maybe we should talk about things that have actually come out of this, because they have published papers and kind of shown their work in some sense. And maybe that gives some insights into what they're really doing and how much value it really is to the community.
Can I make one more point, though, on that?
Yeah.
So the EU announced that it was going to fund these two, it was going to give a huge amount, like $1 billion of funding for two science projects. And there was a whole very long process of having people apply, and some project won, one of them, some graphene thing, and then the Human Brain Project, which was the Blue Brain Project that had been turned into this proposal for this EU funding, got the funding. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a quote from Jeff Hinton, who's a very, very famous artificial intelligence machine learning researcher.
Who now works for Google.
There's a quote from here. So it's from 2011. So he says, "I deeply don't believe in this project. I think putting a lot of money into understanding how the brain works is an excellent idea. I don't think that pouring it into a project that most people in the field think is crazy is the right thing to do. This is a project dressed up to get flagship money. I've never met anybody who thought it was a good idea. I've met lots of people who think it is a terrible idea. The real problem with that project is that they have no clue how to get a large system like that to learn," which is related to what Josh was saying before. And I guess Hinton is at the forefront of what I was talking before, is like getting systems to learn from data how to be intelligent. Anyway, it's interesting. I think it's worth pointing out, which we haven't really done yet, that like there is a sense, which we'll talk about more later in detail, that a lot of people think this project is kind of crazy.
Yeah, so I mean, we've kind of settled on a conversation dynamic where we're mostly trying to pick it apart, it seems like. But I mean, that's just kind of the way we're looking at it. It seems like it's a bit outrageous, and it seems like every respectable scientist we talk to about this seems to also think like this is kind of crazy. Why did it get so much funding? But it does seem like the popular media and I guess EU people who are not neuroscientists think like, wow, this would be cool. Like, why haven't the neuroscientists gone ahead and done this already? Like, we needed to have some strong, well-driven ego to boost the field and get them to do interesting things. Yeah. But neuroscientists are looking at this and saying, like, this isn't interesting and it's not going to deliver. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe everyone will be wrong. And this guy has the vision and foresight to circumvent the entire scientific process.
Yeah.
Well, so let's see what they've actually done, and that should tell us how likely that is. So they had this original goal of simulating a cortical column, and that goal was announced kind of in 2005, and they say that in 2007, the modeling and simulation of the first rat cortical column, the end of the first phase of that happened, and by 2008, they kind of declared that they had achieved that. But what that really means was never very clearly specified. They say that the model reflects a snapshot of the 14-day-old rat cortex area. They gather their data from an area of sensory cortex. And so basically they've collected a lot of data kind of about the distribution of certain properties, say the probability of connectivity between different cell types and the location of synapses on cells and these sorts of things and all these parameters related to cell types. And they declared that they, I guess, captured those sufficiently and successfully put them all together into a unifying model.
And again, to keep in mind what we mean by a model or a simulation, right? They built a set of mathematical equations, implemented it in code, and ran a simulation which produced artificial activity that's supposed to resemble the physical system that they were modeling. And when most scientists produce a model and write a paper about it and possibly post code on the internet showing that they've done this, the paper itself isn't just a statement, hey, we did something. Look at this. The paper is why the model was useful, what predictions it makes, what data it explained from previous experiments, what data you might be able to acquire in future experiments to help evaluate it. It isn't just like kind of a celebration. So there's something peculiar to scientists when they hear about a paper that says, hey, look, we've got a pretty movie that shows a whole bunch of activity of neurons, but we don't know what it means. We don't know why it's useful. It's just, look, it's pretty. It emerged from
what happened.
I couldn't find a paper that declared the simulation of the column happened.
So where did they declare this?
There was, in the Society for Neuroscience conference, which is an annual conference that has about 30,000 neuroscientists attended, in 2012 they presented basically an entire row of posters on things that they've discovered supposedly from this, and it included mostly details of the experimental setups and where they were collecting data from. They basically had like a poster, I think, that showed that, and a poster that showed certain things about, distributions of connectivity, kind of patterns they had seen across animals in certain aspects of those kinds of things, or distributions of certain morphology details. I think there was something about the angle of dendrites to the cell body, those sorts of things. And so
just for context, when you present a poster or a set of posters at something like SFN, it's not an indication that other researchers agree with what you've done, right? It's just a statement that this is like your advertisement for what you claim to have done, and people permitted you to express that, right?
Yeah, I remember I was at that conference and I remember seeing that entire row of posters, and I looked at it because I thought blue brain's a big thing. There, people talk about this. What have they done? And it doesn't really feel. You don't walk away from it thinking, wow, now I understand something. Whereas a lot of times if you go to a good poster at a conference, the person explaining their work to you and you feel like, oh, now I have like a new idea, this is something that's, you don't just believe that it's true automatically, but it's something to think about and it can be interesting. Whereas going to that row of posters kind of almost felt like medicine. It was like, well, here are like the gritty details. Here's like a number that tells you how many synapses might happen in like a square micrometer or something like that. But it didn't feel like this is like juicy and interesting. It just felt like, I guess if I'm going to build a model someday, I should know these things. I feel like that was what I got from it. Oh, there's perhaps a data set out there that could tell me some detailed information if I ever need that for some bigger project that I'm working on, maybe.
That's one of the potential strengths, to be fair, of large-scale projects, right?
Agreed, yeah.
Organizing things that are already known in coherent ways that are easy to access and look up so that people don't have to keep kind of reinventing the wheel or just not being able to find information.
Yeah, and having standardized ways of collecting it and storing it and that sort of thing, which they work on. That's part of one of the things that they are focusing on is it's a field called neuroinformatics, where you look into how to kind of collect all the data that's out there about neuroscience and put it into nice, accessible formats for anyone who wants to know things.
Again, the catch, though, about that, if you don't know what's interesting, like, neuroscience is still, like, kind of an exploratory field. It appears to be in its early days still. And if you don't know exactly what data you should have, there are things you can do, right? Obviously, that's not to say you shouldn't try to make the data coherent and things like this. But a lot of it really is viewed, I think, as provisional by most researchers, right? Like, oh, it might turn out that we've been collecting this data and it needs extra meta information that we haven't put there yet. So, maybe you'll have to do it again later on. It's still worth doing now and things like this. But to kind of presume that you're going to be like the center of everything, unless you really can solve the whole task yourself, which I think these people have, the impression that they can. But unless you're going to solve the whole task yourself, it's not clear if you can presume to set the standard for everyone.
Yeah, so that's another kind of large-scale criticism of this whole endeavor, is that, of course, it's good to have big projects that want to like organize and so on, but very few people think that on the level of like understanding the brain, are we anywhere close to having all of the ideas or knowing what the relevant data is or the relevant levels of detail for whatever problem you're interested in and all that kind of thing. So it just all seems kind of misguided. So like the Allen Brain Institute, for example, they have some efforts to standardize certain things that I think people think are less misguided, because they're kind of standardizing things that are, good brain atlases for multiple species, where you have, the brain atlas is basically, it's literally it's an atlas of different brain areas where you can look up where brain areas are across animals in relation to one another in sort of detailed ways.
I think Tim Reckwarth has a nice article about this in Nautilus, right? That one of his points is that there really isn't so much big science, there's big engineering, and when something like the Human Genome Project comes along, right, sequencing the genome isn't a science project. It's a technically difficult feat that requires some engineering and technology development. And similarly, the way like the US Brain Initiative is ostensibly structured, right, there's a focus on building technologies that will allow researchers to do research better after the big investment and of collaboratively spent money on a big project, right? Build new tools for recording from large populations of neurons, and this will help all of the researchers in the field do better research in the future. Yeah, so there's kind of an ambiguity as to whether you're doing science or engineering in these settings, and the Human Brain Project claims to be solving the brain, and they're putting a very specific tool-based approach to it that it's not clear that other researchers want to use. I mean, they kind of say something along the lines of, we're building a facility to build models of the brain, I think was a quote from Henry Markram in some context. And that's a nice idea, but it's not clear, what they mean by that. I mean, if the facility is something that only they as researchers think is the way of going about it.
And they also, I mean, at different times, different things are stated as the main point of this, but I feel like they very much think that they're doing science purely, and that it's not just meant to be an engineering project to help people later do proper science on the brain, but to actually be the science itself. Even when, in some of the descriptions of their work, there's kind of a very grandiose explanation of what these things mean. I mean, even a finding that seems kind of simple, interesting and simple, but something related to the way that cells are distributed in a certain area or something, whenever they find these kinds of rules, they'll just describe it as like, and this is incredibly important because it means such and such, and like this will be a very, relevant finding to the community and all these sorts of things. And you just, it doesn't seem like this project is producing science that is any better than what would be done without it under this big head of this project and with the simulation and all that sort of thing.
I mean, given that they're getting €1 billion funding, it might be like significantly worse than what would be done if you distributed the €1 billion differently, right?
Yeah, so just for context, I'm kind of curious what your opinions are on the extent to which science should be decentralized or unified, right? So like, we've been talking a lot about this project, and it seems like a lot of researchers, feel like this is a misguided approach. And, you could, as an external observer, say, hey, well, that's just those researchers didn't get the big money. Like if one of these guys who, is against this was given $1 billion, what would they do? Would they use it better? So, do you think that it's the right approach to give any one person $1 billion? Do you think that people should, the money should be split amongst like a large number of labs to kind of, give people paychecks for 5 years or something? I don't know what the right thing to do is in this setting, as an alternative. I
feel like in neuroscience, given the state of it, how it doesn't seem particularly ready for like huge unification. I'd be kind of suspicious of anybody who would want to have to distribute €1 billion, to be honest. Like, I think like if you, like, some of the people that I work with, I feel like I can imagine, professors that I work with, if I was like, I'm going to give you €1 billion, I can imagine them kind of saying, like, I don't want €1 billion, I'll have like couple million to run my lab. Like, I don't know where to put €1 billion.
Yeah.
I'd have to read a lot of proposals.
Yeah.
And that would not be the best use of my time.
Yeah. No one...
But Markram loves this stuff, right? Like, he wants to be...
To the point of excluding other people from being in the decision-making, or so it's said. Yeah, it seems especially problematic if you're giving a person who, if there were some sort of, like, contest for who all of the neuroscientists feel is best suited for this, that would be one thing, because then that the vision of that person, would reflect what
it's like
everyone
a democratically elected scientist chancellor or something.
But that's not exactly how this played out.
How did it play out? I mean...
So I don't know who made the decisions as to Markram.
It was a European Commission thing, right? I mean,
for the billion
was
euro.
it politicians or was it scientists or some mixture of both?
It's clear that they must have been, not specific to the field because they were evaluating projects that were vastly different. Like we said, the other project that got funded was on graphene. So I think it was not necessarily people in the field voting. Whereas I think the U.S. Brain Initiative is having a more kind of collaborative approach in determining who works
a lot
on
of
the
well-respected people in neuroscience are kind of on a panel, and then the money gets distributed amongst lots of research groups.
Yeah. And I think it's... So there's been explicit criticism, which we can get into, but for me, kind of the thing that just shows how, some people might say, oh, they're criticizing because they're jealous and they wish they could be doing that or something like that. But I just remember when I came back from the Society for Neuroscience conference the year that the row of posters for Blue Brain was up, no one was talking about it. It wasn't like I came back to, the computational neuroscientists I know, and everyone was like, did you see the Blue Brain row? People were talking about other things that they found more interesting. And I think that just kind of shows that
if a lab that's got $1 million over 5 years can do more interesting work than a $1 billion enterprise, that's not.
To be fair, at that point they hadn't gotten their billions yet. But I think that kind of shows that people aren't that excited about what they're churning out.
I'm sure, that will change if they start doing amazing things. But
so maybe we should talk about the kind of changes that have happened fairly recently. So as we said, they got this funding for €1 billion to simulate the human brain in a computer, and there has been this open letter that was signed by something around the order of 800 scientists that was a criticism of the project both in its scientific goals and how it's been managed. So since the Blue Brain project started in 2005, and then in I think like 2012 is when they kind of officially started trying to get this money for the Human Brain Project and switching over into that. So people kind of have had time to see how this project is run and that sort of thing. And just a lot of people have had a lot of problems with it, especially people in Europe who some of the research that's done is done by the people in the Human Brain Project themselves, but a lot of work is done in collaboration with other labs. And people have to kind of get funding through this project. And so there's just been kind of a backlash to the way funding is distributed through this and the choices that are being made and that sort of thing. And so people signed this letter saying they wanted transparency and accountability, and they want perhaps to change the structure of the governance in the Human Brain Project. And, they threatened that if these kind of changes don't happen, then these scientists are going to be unwilling to collaborate with the people at the Human Brain Project. So it's a pretty significant thing for the people who were in charge of that funding to receive this open letter.
And a lot of important, very these are not in any sense fringe people. Like, this is really
the people signing the letter are
the core
very mainstream core. Even core within computational neuroscience, which is it's relevant because this is in some sense largely a computational neuroscience project, right? Modeling the brain,
especially as it was sold. I mean, they are collecting a lot of data, but they always made the focus of it the simulation, and so you're gonna have to answer to people who know about that kind of thing. So one of the people who signed it was Eve Marder, who's a professor at Brandeis, and I just like the quote that she had, which is, "The model is destined to fail to produce new understanding because it will be as complex as the biological system, but wrong." And so I think that kind of sums up what people feel about it. Yeah.
She's cool.
So there was a
Although,
response.
to be fair, it's complex, but you can access all of the elements, which is
Sure, yeah. But if it's wrong, who cares?
Yeah, I agree.
So there was a response to this open letter, and there was a mediation process that went on, and there was a report from that that came out fairly recently in early 2015. And so basically it suggested some pretty significant changes both to the science. They kind of wanted clearer goals and almost a shift towards a more U.S. Brain Initiative style where it's a focus on tools and that sort of thing. In this case, a focus on the neuroinformatics and kind of a focus on high-performance computing, being able to use these large supercomputers for neuroscience applications and advancing the technology for that.
And you mean for generic neuroscience simulations, not just the blue brain style
The idea would be that anything that they gain here could be used by anyone, that sort of thing. And I think they do some work with data visualization and that sort of thing. So there was a focus on that. There was also, I think, when I looked at kind of the summary of this report, was that there was an even larger focus on changing the governance. You know, people definitely have criticism of the science, and we've touched on some of those, but they really seem to be unhappy with the way that things were being handled. I think they said that, it was like kind of 3 people who were in charge.
3-person executive committee involving Markram and 2 of his buddies. Presumably, it's insane.
Yeah. So they definitely wanted that to be broken down and to have, transparency and an ability for, I guess, everyone to have a say in the direction that these billion euros will be taken.
So this is kind of happening now, right?
Yeah, these are kind of being put into place now.
So this letter was signed and came out, and then I don't know exactly to what degree it was a reaction, but the European Commission then, presumably they have some standardized review process for these big projects, but
yeah, I think
they have this report now.
I think the letter came out in July of 2014, and I think I saw that it was kind of like in anticipation of their upcoming review, and so they thought, they want to get this letter out there when the Commission is reviewing the project to make it clear that people outside of the project, and even people within the project, weren't very happy with it. But so, I actually saw a quote which surprised me. It said that Blue Brain got this flagship award because the other projects were worse. Like the other projects that were up for the flagship award were not as good. So that's not a great reason to spend €1 billion, I wouldn't say.
Maybe it is this thing. Exactly. There weren't many proposals. So maybe like what I was saying before, like, who the hell... did they want to have a neuroscience project? I don't know. But who in neuroscience is going to come along and say...
It wasn't just neuroscience, it's interesting.
Yeah, it was open to everything, but who in most fields are so confident to come along and say, yes, give me €1 billion?
It's very strange for a scientist to sort of confidently assert that they could productively spend $1 billion on a large-scale project.
That should be the red flag, is if someone applied for this, they're not qualified for it. Because they don't have the right temperament to do proper science like this.
That's it. And I think if people...
of course people could spend $1 billion.
Yeah.
But if you gave most people $1 billion, they'd find a way to spend it.
Yeah.
But to say that that's like an effective use of resources...
I think what most reasonable people would say is just build a research facility or just distribute it to these people. They'd be like, if you asked some reasonable, good... I'm thinking of people, neuroscientists, what do I do with this €1 billion? They'd probably be like, okay, give me 3 weeks and I'll sit down and write a list of a couple hundred names and I'll just give those people an equal share and they'll do great things in the next 10 years. Right? And then,
Yeah, I think that seems...
Yeah,
people would love that, right?
But when it's political, it's like the European Commission wants to we're going to advance science right now. We're going to give you $1 billion. Sorry, that's just not how it's going to go.
It's a lot easier to, drum up excitement if it's just this one thing, like we're going to do this thing and then everything will be great. But I think there's a quote from Markram in response to kind of these suggestions, or I don't even know if they're suggestions. They probably have to do the recommendations from the report. But he said that he thinks that these recommendations will turn their visionary project into an average one. and that the in silico brain simulation was the unique selling point of the Human Brain Project.
Yes.
So he doesn't like that emphasis is being taken off of that.
Stop making it reasonable. I want this to be like a front for my ridiculous ambition that I've had for the last 15 years.
Empire.
This is absurd.
Yeah, it's interesting though because it does feel like a lot of this was kind of like a PR issue. Because if they had sold it as we want to do a lot of controlled experiments where we'll collect, good data across many animals of these precise things, and then that data will be available, and these sorts of things. I mean,
and it'll be a neuroinformatics thing. Everyone will be able to access through clean web portals all the data, and it'll be.
To be fair, I don't think they ever promised that, and I don't think that that's happening. So I guess they couldn't have said that. But just the idea of selling it in a more sober way, that's just something that would be helpful.
It would have to be more sober, and they could have sold it that way.
Yeah.
And I think it was both sold badly, but I think a lot of the reselling of it has been largely, to get this money, probably. I mean, because those kind of quotes from Markham are revealing, right? That, like, really to him, like, that was the kind of main thing. There's a quote from Peter Diane here, I think we mentioned him earlier. He's a very well-known computational neuroscientist who works at UCL in London. He says that the notion that we know enough about the brain to know what we should simulate is crazy, quite frankly. Like, which is like, that's pretty strong.
That's a strong
right?
statement for a scientist to make.
And he's like a
crazy.
patently reasonable guy. And it's just to give people a sense of this is considered like it's a bit of a farce. This whole thing. It's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, I went to a conference in Montreal that was a computational neuroscience conference, and Sean Hill, who's kind of the second in command of this project, spoke there trying to tell everyone what their findings had been. And I felt that the question session afterwards was like pretty harsh, harsher than it had been for any of the other speakers that day. People were very not willing to accept that what they were doing was worth it. They were asking questions that to me seemed very reasonable. I mean, a big criticism that is kind of being corrected after this review process is that they're not focusing on what would be called kind of cognitive or systems neuroscience, where you would actually have an animal performing some sort of task and try to track how the information is being processed in their brain to accomplish that task. I mean,
so again, this is like anesthetized or anesthetized animals are slices of animal brains that have been checked out kind of in dishes, and then they're trying to build the whole simulation from that using kind of the statistical distributions of connectivities and neuronal properties.
So it's not
and
at
then
all
just,
clear.
again, expect that the behaviorals will come out of that.
Which embodies a very high-level hypothesis in a way, right? Which is that if you slice up a brain and map all the connectivities in some statistical way and whatever else, and then put it all together and simulate it, it'll be an animal, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I
might
think
be true.
I mean, if you had the same brain and you cut it up and you probed it and you got a perfect reconstruction of it, I think most neuroscientists would say, yeah, that has to work. But I mean, they're looking at sort of statistical properties of subsets of many different animals' brains, putting it together. It's
simulating it imperfectly because it has to be. Nothing's going to be a perfect simulation. And so again, we go back to the idea they've made some choices about what's relevant to them. Maybe the important things were not included in their model. But I think it's fitting that, or kind of obvious that Eve Marder would sign this letter in criticism of this project, because she's kind of known for advocating this position that, averages won't work when you're looking at the brain, because she has work that shows different animals, actual individual animals, not like different species or something, will be kind of executing the same task in slightly different ways. Their neural circuitry will be slightly different, but in the end it gets the same thing done. And so if you averaged something about that connectivity across all the animals, you might average away the thing that is actually accomplishing the goal in the animal. And so if they're using averages in their simulation, it's not clear that it would...
And by averages, you mean they're not looking at, enough structure in the data.
Yeah, they're not, yeah. So yes, again, if you replicate an individual animal, maybe you could get something to work, but if you're replicating something that's based on an aggregate of animals, you might not.
I think a way of summarizing that, I suspect a reasonable way of summarizing that might be, and this gets back at Jeff Hinton's point. So Jeff Hinton was that machine learning researcher that we mentioned earlier. And again, machine learning is all about having systems that learn in some sense from data to do things. And he said the critical thing for him is that the Human Brain Project, these simulations don't involve learning. It might be I can imagine this being being a situation where they might create kind of great initial conditions.
But then you would have still to train it.
Yeah, but then the training might be the whole thing, and the training will probably induce.
I mean, again, this is kind of like I really feel like, I mean, if they build kind of like a baby brain, like it's the brain of a generic animal that hasn't learned anything.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of ridiculous to think that you could put a whole bunch of brains together randomly. Even if you took small parts of 1,000 different brains and kind of attempted to glue them together, you wouldn't expect for it to work immediately. Yeah. Like, even if that were a good model, you'd still have to make sure you smooth it over by giving them some experience.
Yeah. It was actually interesting. I hadn't really thought about it explicitly in that way before, but maybe they'll just have sort of initial conditions, and then they'll need to know all of the plasticity rules at all the synapses, which maybe they'll propose to find, and then they'll do that, and then it'll turn into a brain.
Yeah, I think there's an instinctive kind of distaste when a lot of computational neuroscientists had heard about this problem from the beginning. Like, oh, you're going to do everything in extreme detail, and like, okay, and what of it, and that sort of thing. Like, first of all, like a belief that you're probably not going to be able to capture all the detail, and then even if you do, like, what does that really mean, and all that sort of thing. It's reasonable given what we know about what has worked in the past in terms of trying to understand the brain, but it comes with its own implicit assumptions. Like, I will openly admit that I assume that the angles of dendrites hitting the cell body doesn't matter, and so they can characterize that all that they want, but it's probably not of interest to me in the level that I want to understand the brain. But both sides have implicit assumptions, and I mean, this could, end up being a test of kind of whose assumptions are better. But I mean, there have been
a lot of very reasonable people are very confident about the answer to that question.
Yeah, I don't know if they're like, there's a lot of people who think that this isn't worth the risk and the cost. I mean, as you said, maybe this, if we're being generous with how we're interpreting the prospects for this project, maybe this will be a good initial conditions on which you can train a model. But again, if they're using computers that run 200 times slower than real time, you'd have to train this model on human level sensory input for like 200 years. I mean, of course, the computers will get faster, granted, so it won't actually be that long. Yeah. But it's just not clear that this is like a well-chosen direction. Maybe it'll work. Maybe you could get it to work. I mean, maybe, if you did anything with enough money and enough resources and attempted to move in the direction of the brain, maybe you're going to make some non-trivial step at all. But, Yeah,
but the point is that, like, just to zoom out, right, you can be as generous as you want, but it's like, if what you demand of a €1 billion project is that they make some non-trivial steps at all, it's kind of like, maybe you're not spending your money correctly. Right?
Agreed, yeah.
No, it definitely comes down to, I mean, a lot of the criticism being so vocal comes down to the fact that so much is being spent on it and that there is a risk.
Just could afford to pay like all of the European neuroscientists for a decade or something. I don't know.
I mean, probably not, but like a lot of it.
Yeah.
€1 billion is a huge amount of money in research, and it's like outrageous to a lot of people, I think, at the moment, when funding is pretty scarce, and a lot of scientists are being trained with PhDs and then postdocs after that, and can't get faculty positions. I think a lot of people feel like, what? Why are we giving this person €1 billion when we could start 500 more? I mean, for...
Yeah, sure. And it's not just the people who are directly involved, like other European scientists who could be getting that money. There's also a sense that, this will just be kind of like a bad mark on computational neuroscience or neuroscience generally. Like, oh, we gave those neuroscientists €1 billion and they still haven't figured out how to, like, cure my diseases or anything like that.
Yeah, from the inside of science, to the extent that, a graduate student is inside science, it is interesting to, like, think about how much people are kind of aware of publicity and how the public public impressions are very relevant for a field, right? So neuroscientists are very much aware, I think, of the extent to which other neuroscientists oversell their work, journalists misinterpret science and present it in disingenuous ways to the public. These things are I think, concerning to neuroscientists. And it's easy to say, oh, well, then you should correct it. It's like, yeah, if a journalist who works for the New York Times writes a shoddy article, not that they all do, and if there are good articles on science
Yeah,
published there.
definitely.
But if someone who works for the New York Times writes something stupid or some other journal or a newspaper, it's not the case that an average scientist is going to be able to respond to that directly in the same venue, even if they read the article and send something to the editor.
Yeah. So this like kind of nuanced debate that's happening amongst people about this project, doesn't always make it out of science. The person on the street might just know that this huge project is being funded. They might not know that there was a letter signed saying, we don't think it's the best idea and maybe it should be reconsidered and that sort of thing.
That does seem to be getting some publicity, which is really
Yeah.
good because it's good that those people did that.
Yeah, and that very formalized way makes it easier to be obvious to people that there has been criticism.
Yeah. So, in summary, we talked about this Human Brain Project, which is a hugely expensive project funded by the European Commission as one of their 2 flagship science projects that they decided to fund a few years ago. The main focus is to simulate the human brain in some ridiculous level of detail. It is headed by a guy called Henry Markham, who is effectively a sort of religious leader. Nobody thinks it's a good idea, except for him and his cronies.
And a couple of people near him.
And apparently it goes on with some changes because all of the reasonable scientists told them to change it.
I have faith that the changes will make it. It'll salvage it, I think.
You think so?
Really?
Yeah.
There's no salvaging it. They already probably spent like half of the money.
No.
It's
They,
been like a
they
year.
haven't even gotten half of the money yet, I don't think.
I think they've gotten very little of the money.
Yeah. So I have hope that other people in charge of things will focus on the right ways to spend.
Yeah.
Lots
Spend it on
of
some
euros.
decent experiments, make
Yeah.
some good computers,
Share the data.
share data.
Yeah.
It's all good stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah. I guess we'll see.
Meanwhile, I'll not get a faculty position and go work in a goddamn bank or whatever. So, till next time.